Welcome. The McCourt School, the youngest school at Georgetown, is very proud to be building on the long tradition of working for the common good at Georgetown as we tackle complex problems that we face locally, nationally, and globally. And there is no more complex or urgent problem than climate change. And it is really a privilege to be here with other alumni and community members to have this opportunity to talk about these issues. Now, I am Maria Cancian. I'm the Dean of the McCourt School, and I used to think of climate change and environmental policy as quite distant from my own area of expertise, which is social policy. But over time, it's become clear to me that these issues are front and center for everything that we do. I had an opportunity to be part of the Biden-Harris transition team, and my responsibilities were for the Department of Health and Human Services, the Social Security Administration, and Veterans Affairs. So you would say probably not much to do with climate. But even in these agencies, we were very focused as we planned for the transition on environmental issues, whether we were thinking about the environmental consequences of government's physical plant or the health implications of climate change. So while I have just a little bit of focus on these issues, today we have a chance to talk with some real experts. And I could not be more excited about the amazing group of people that we have to join us today. And since I want you to mostly hear from them, I will give you just very short introductions. But Parrish Bergquist is an assistant professor at the McCourt School and an expert on environmental policy and politics in the US, and the most recent addition to a growing cadre of environmental scholars at the McCourt School.
Cool.
Monica Medina is the founder and publisher of Our Daily Planet. She teaches at SFF and is collaborating across campus, including in organizing with the McCourt School's GU Politics last year's extraordinary climate forum, where students literally camped out overnight to get a seat to participate, and Gaston Hall was filled to the brim. J.W. Postal is a McCourt School alum from back in the days when we were the Georgetown Public Policy Institute, or GPPI. He is founder and CEO of Nikola Power and an experienced innovator in the renewable energy industry. And last but not least, Trish Wilson is climate and environmental editor at the Washington Post. And I don't think I've ever used this phrase before. Her most recent Pulitzer Prize
Thank you.
Was received in 2020 for a series on climate change. So we have just a phenomenal set of people here with us today. And I will say I've had great fun in a couple of preparatory conversations that we had, just listening to folks and having them answer my relatively ignorant questions. I'm sure that the folks that have joined us for this call have better questions, and we will have time for Q&A towards the end of our time. But what I'd like to do is just get started with a few questions for our panelists. And I want to kind of get your insights about where we stand. This is really a moment of just tremendous change and possibility. We have a new administration that has a very different stance on climate change than the previous administration at the federal level in the US. We have global events, including the COVID pandemic, that have reshaped our sense both of what is necessary and what is possible as we confront challenges, whether it's climate change or other things. And we are in a moment of profound political divisions that also limit our opportunity and our ability for collective action. So in this context, I want to hope that we will spend this time together exploring what might be accomplished in the coming years and how best to move things forward. We talked earlier today with this group that we really want to focus on what we can do to make things better. And with this panel, we are really in a position to consider kind of a broad range of issues and factors in that progress. So I'd like to start, I'll pick on Monica to start, and just ask you, from your work on the Daily Planet, from your involvement in the climate movement, you know, how can Georgetown, how can the people on this call today in particular help to advance climate solutions in the new era?
Thank you so much, Maria, and thanks for inviting me to be on this incredible panel with some other wonderful Georgetown alums and faculty members. Um, I think Georgetown is perfectly positioned to be the public policy leader in this space in Washington because it's in Washington. You are here where you can hold conversations, where you can be the town square, where you can show the country and the world what good policy means when it comes to climate change. As you alluded to in your opening, climate change affects so many other areas of policy. We used to think of it as its own thing, but now I think we understand that it really is a crosscut across all sectors of our economy and very many facets of our lives. And so public policy is really needed to inform all those areas that has climate in its repertoire. So the fact that you're here in Washington, that you can interact with policymakers, that you can invite them to Gaston Hall or to classrooms to talk about these issues, which is something I do. I love doing in my class. I often bring in advocates and policymakers here in Washington, especially now with Zoom. It's even easier. They don't have to worry about parking. So I love bringing them to campus to educate our students. And what I see is these students going out into the policy world, both in the Foreign Service, but in on the Hill. I mean, some of the highest ranking people in the new Biden administration are Georgetown alums who have studied these issues and are now ready to go because of the education they got at Georgetown. And so I just think there's no place better for this kind of work to be done than Georgetown.
Thank you for that. It's certainly a challenge and a challenge that we want to meet. Now, Monica, you mentioned ways that we can kind of move things forward in terms of government and a couple of other areas. I know, JW, that you have really focused on the ways in which kind of jobs in the clean energy future and things in the private sector can really move us in a positive direction. Often, I think we see things in the private sector as potentially raising concerns for climate change, but I think you've really tried to turn that. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what you see in the future?
Well, thank you for having me, Maria. It's really exciting to be talking with Georgetown folks. You know, when I enrolled at Georgetown, I lived in DC. I was working at National Audubon Society as a fundraiser and a lobbyist. And, you know, I didn't want to go up to Boston for the Kennedy School, and I really wanted to stay in DC. And so I sort of created my own master's degree in the environmental policy within the McCourt School previous name. And so you know, I worked on debt for nature swaps, and the school really, you know, it wasn't quite ready to talk about climate policy or any of those things. Still got a great education. And I think what I would say to students is both in the business sector and the policy sector, this industry is just booming. So whether it's solar, wind, energy storage, and I work at the inflection of a lot of those electric vehicles, EV charging, AI and machine learning technology that's going to drive all of this. Every one of those companies needs public policy leadership and government affairs leadership at the state level, county level, federal level. So just as an example, when I moved back to Colorado, I ended up lobbying to get legislation passed for this crazy thing called community solar, which was the idea you build a solar farm in the middle of nowhere and people would subscribe to a percentage of the power coming off this solar garden versus being up on a roof. And I went into the state capitol and I knew a lot of people and I had been involved, but it was 40-1, the utility lobbyists against me and my little company. But we got it done. We got the first bill ever for community solar passed. And that's the kind of work that graduates who graduate with a public policy degree can get out there and do. You know, our industry is not all engineers, it's business people, it's public policy, it's writers, it's thinkers, and we need all of that in the private sector. So the private sector finally has the partner I think we need at the federal level, which we certainly haven't had for the last 4 years. So that's exciting. And I think we are at a perfect inflection point. I've been working at this for 30 years to see stop fighting about solar and wind and making it political. And it's just energy. It's better energy, it's cleaner energy, and now, guess what? It's actually cheaper energy. Wind and solar are cheaper than any new natural gas plant or coal plant, if you look at just the math, much less a nuclear facility. So really excited about where we're headed. I think the next 30 years are going to be the most incredible sea change we're ever going to have. It is the way to come out of this pandemic, is to tie all stimulus dollars, and we're seeing this in Europe, stimulus dollars to clean, grow back better, or just be back better, and use that money for clean policy, clean energy policy, and I'm really excited about it. So that's a little bit about what I'm thinking about in the private sector.
Well, that's great to hear, and I want to kind of ask for all the panelists, I'll say from an outside perspective, it really seems to me like we've made extraordinary progress in the last 10 years. Like the technology has moved forward much faster than a non-expert like me might have expected, and that things have moved forward faster, become cheaper and economically more viable, just much more quickly. We've just had tremendous innovation. Is that do I have the right impression?
Yeah, I'll just jump in for a second, because my first solar project, which I worked on in 2008, we priced everything at $10 per watt. That same project today would be $1.15 a watt, $1.50 a watt. So that's about an 85 to 90% drop in just the total solar economics of a project. And that is why solar today is the cheapest form of energy. We still have a federal incentive, but yeah, you are correct. I mean, the last 10 years have seen a dramatic price drop in PV equipment, energy storage equipment, wind equipment, and that is driving the free market, not public policy, to make these decisions and adopt cleaner energies, because it's cheaper and better, and it's it's headed in the right direction.
I want to add that if we're talking, in talking about solutions, I think government regulation obviously is hugely important to incentivize a green economy, but we really are seeing that market forces are front and center toward incentivizing the kind of change that we need. I think it's very interesting that at the Washington Post, when I first joined a couple of years ago, we were talking about coal, and my reporters were like, "Trish, don't even worry about coal. Coal's dead. You can't, it's just the money does not work. Coal is gone. Let's go, now we're going to talk about fracking and oil and so on and so forth." So it's very interesting. And the other thing that's hopeful, I think, for incentivizing change is what's happening in finance, as we were talking about earlier, and how investment funds and investors in general are much more interested in being able to, themselves sleep at night, right, by incentivizing a greener world for us.
Well, so you talk about investors, which is also just kind of related to public overall and their engagement. And Parrish, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about how the public gets engaged and how the public perceives these issues. And, where does the public stand on climate change, and what is the role of the public and on voters in pushing climate action forward, both as voters and consumers?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question. So, well, one thing I'll just say quickly to what JW mentioned, he was talking about bundling climate policy in with stimulus funding, and we know that there is strong public support for bundling like that, for comprehensive solutions. But more broadly, concern about climate change and support for climate policy are rising. They're rising somewhat slowly. It can look a little sticky, and that can actually be a bit discouraging in a way. Because we want to see, if we're people who care about climate change and want to see strong public support for climate action, maybe we want to see like a skyrocketing trend line. That's not what we see, but this is pretty typical. Public opinion tends to be sort of pretty stable around, if you ask somebody, do you favor or support something, or how much do you care? Do you believe in climate change? These kinds of questions tend to be pretty stable. They are going up slowly. What matters though, and we are seeing a big change, is the salience of this issue. So how intensely people care about it, how much they think about it. And that has really been going up in the last few years. This is an issue that voters are thinking about, that they're prioritizing, and that they want the government to prioritize. One caveat there is that we're seeing really strong increases in the salience of this issue among Democrats, and Republicans are still less concerned about it. So there is a still really strong partisan divide there. However, that also indicates an important sort of political strategy, which is that if you ask Democrats and Republicans what's the most important issue in the election, for Democrats, climate policy or climate change was much higher. For Republicans, the economy tends to be the most important issue. So tying climate policy with economic development is a winner. We also see strong support for climate policy across the parties, but that depends on the particular type of policy. So when policy can be framed as economic development and is bringing economic benefits, that's politically attractive, and the public tends to support incentives and research and development and even regulatory policy more than things that look like a tax, or where the public's going to experience the cost directly. The public is pretty cost sensitive, so it's important to design climate policy so that costs aren't visible and painful. Movements have done a really great job of helping to prioritize this issue and make it really salient, and encouraging politicians to prioritize it in the campaign agenda and on the government agenda, and that's really important to continue doing, particularly because the majority of the public, there is an issue public that cares really intensively about climate change, but a lot of people are following, they're worried about a lot of other things going on in their lives, and they tend to follow the national elite political discourse when they're thinking about how to think about this issue. But that issue public has a really important role to play in shaping the discourse that's happening at the government level. And then I guess the last thing I'll say is that at the end of the day, public opinion matters most importantly through voting. And if elected officials know that they're going to be held accountable for a decision that they make on the environment, they will take it more seriously. And so that's another important role that movements and an issue public can play in keeping this issue visible and letting politicians know that the decisions they make are going to have consequences for them at the ballot box. That's also really important.
That makes a lot of sense. Oh, go ahead.
I'll jump in and say, I think one other thing that's impacting public opinion is that they can see climate changing. They can see, and Trish's great reporting at the Post on the 2 degrees and how just warming 2 degrees on average in certain places has completely transformed them. So that was, where is it extreme? But even if you look at a place like Phoenix, which was above 100 degrees for months as the high temperature for months this summer. And when you look at the number of hurricanes, the number of weather disasters overall, the fires, people can see it. And I think they know something's up. And that does help to move the needle. I also think it's picking up in certain places where you might not expect climate to be as accepted, this science about climate, and that's in the Farm Belt, where they've been really impacted by floods and terrible storms, this derecho, the storm that blew over the corn crop in the Midwest. So things like that really do move the needle. The other thing is farmers are also seeing an opportunity to put solar farms on their farms, and that's another way for them to balance their to be able to make a living in farming when the weather is as changeable as it is, as hard as it is to depend on it. So in little ways, I think Americans' lives are changing because of it, and the more we can tell those stories. And when I was at NOAA in the government, we used to be afraid to talk about weather as related to climate. Weather is what is outside today, like snow, but what you expect is the climate. And now we connect those things more than we used to before. Scientists are more and more comfortable with that. And again, that helps the public to see that it's not just something 50 years from now to worry about, but it's today and now and impacting their lives.
I will say, I definitely agree with you, Monica, and that's a documented effect that I even have some research that demonstrates, but it does tend to be I just want to highlight the role of the media and even political voices in being really crucial to sort of translate that effect, because the public doesn't necessarily see climate change and automatically sort of experience it as a changing climate. There's some translation often that that the media is really, really helpful for, and the political discourse, even in these research studies that find an effect of having experienced a climatic event, that effect tends to be much smaller than the effect of the political discourse. So this is changing, and you're completely right. And I think, but if the media and politics were sort of magnifying that message rather than in some cases either muting it or contradicting it, I think we'd see a much sort of more dramatic change.
Well, and that's why the McCourt School, back to policy, the McCourt School is so perfectly positioned to help even politicians learn how to talk about this issue and how to explain it to voters and how to make good policy around it. So that's why the forum was such a great thing when we had 13 candidates for president come, and each of them spend an hour on campus, and the room was full for almost every single one of them, and that was 2 days straight. So I think there is a hunger for this, and it doesn't have to be just that one off. You all the time, you had John Kerry here, you had Al Gore here at campus. You provide a perfect place for that conversation to happen.
I mean, it's funny for me to think back that when JW was at what is now the McCourt School, he really had to kind of create a degree out of kind of not much that was there. And now not only do we count on people like Monica who are across campus, but we have 5 faculty who really have as a focal interest climate change at the McCourt School, and we're growing. And so we have both, you know, a critical mass of students and of faculty expertise. And then we can weave that together with things like GU Politics, which really allows us to work with you, Monica, and others to have the climate forum and to really engage with people in politics and in the press. And I just want to turn to Trish here, because Monica, you mentioned her piece, and Parrish, you mentioned the importance of kind of translating. I would say that some of the work that Trish has done and that Monica does actually in this space is even more than translating. It's framing and doing the investigative work to really know what needs to be said, as well as translating. But that's so critical to kind of moving people forward on this. And Trish, I just wondered if you would just think about, talk to us about the role of the media in enhancing the public's and voters' appreciation for the issue, and kind of what's changed and what do you see in the future?
Well, I think one of the interesting changes really was a couple of years ago when everything was kind of looking grimmer and grimmer with all of these events that we've seen. And that's when the Post decided to set up a separate climate and environment team. That's when I joined the Post, and we talked about what do we do now that we can write, you know, just cover the environment and climate however we want to. 5 reporters and myself, and then we co-opted a whole bunch of our colleagues. And one thing that I have been an environmental editor before in the 90s and in the early aughts. And so I had moved on to terrorism and international investigations. And now I was back in the world of the environment. So I'd been down this path of climate change, nobody cares. It's 30 years from now, 40 years from now, everybody will be dead. And so the point was, let's not talk about the debate. I said, I don't want to talk about the debate at all. I don't want to write about it. It's not a he said, she said, gonna happen, not gonna happen. It's happening. It's a gerund, okay? And so that was like pretty much my contribution to my team, was to say, let's not talk about the future. Let's not talk about the models. Let's stop doing all that. And let's just talk about the now. Let's talk about category. What was it? The category, it was, yeah, they wanted a category 5 hurricane instead of category 4. I mean, there's so much happening on the planet to write about. So once we knew what we were going to do to write about what's happening now, it was all quite not that difficult. I mean, it's all in front of us. But something, by showing in the 2C Beyond the Limits series that the planet has already warmed 2 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution, that's news. And that met the mission right on, right? The mission was, let's write about what's happening now. And we did. To say something though about the media really, that's a big, broad word. And so we are not all the same. I'm very different than television. I'm not, the Washington Post is more of a establishment kind of mainstream media than other particular kinds. But we have written so many stories, and we often get worried that people just don't read them. We can see the metrics on every story we write. If we get 7,000 readers on a story about climate change, that is a fail. Okay, we're supposed to be way up there, like a lot, many times that number. And so that is we're writing a lot of stories. We don't always get them in front of as many people as we would like. So I'm just pointing that out. We can't make them all be bad news. We have to write about hope. We have a whole page that we devote to climate solutions. So I just wanted to make that point. And then finally, I'm not the only Hoya on my team. 2 of my reporters, Sarah Kaplan and Desmond Butler, are also graduates of Georgetown.
Well, as a relatively new, I'm not really a Hoya, but an honorary Hoya by virtue of being dean. I will say I am astounded by how many Hoyas there are in critical positions, and really inspired by it, because I really think that this kind of motivation of working for the common good, which now that I have been here for a couple of years, I understand is actually really deeply held by our graduates and our faculty. I think really that's what we need right now. I mean, we need, we say at McCourt that we try to have rigorously trained, ethically grounded folks that are, focused on the common good. And that combination, I think, in climate change, in COVID, across a number of things, having the skills to really think about these questions and what the solutions are, and then having that ethical grounding of a Georgetown education, and then having that access, being plugged in, being really focused, whether it's in Washington or, I'm a big fan of innovation comes from the States. JW, you've given us a couple of examples of that. And so we have a lot of things at other places, and obviously climate change is a global issue. But I think we really are well positioned to really contribute to this. I wanted to pick up on something that you said, Tricia, about the need to be hopeful, the need to kind of not just talk about the downsides. And I wanted to ask the folks on this panel, when you think about the reasons to be hopeful, when you think about why we might be in a better place in 5 years or in 25 years, but I think 5 years is good. Most of us have a hard time getting our head around 25 years. What makes you most hopeful, and what would you like to see? What would you hope that would be true in 5 years that's different from today? And I'm gonna pick on JW first, because I know that you are kind of just in the midst of a whole bunch of technological and organizational initiatives where 5 years really is a relevant timeframe.
Yeah. I am incredibly hopeful. So I got into solar in 2008. I sold my investment business, joined the Obama campaign, and I met a bunch of entrepreneurs on that campaign, and we formed a solar company. And so fast forwarding to where we are today, I think the next 5 years are going to be perhaps the greatest transformation of business, and the connective points between business, policy, jobs. It's no longer, do you care about the environment in the poll and the research and the politics? It's, do you care about a job? And that job just happens to be in solar or wind or energy storage. So I think it's really happening right now, and it really is truly an exciting time. At the state level, it really is incredible how impactful, thoughtful people can be. You can walk into the building in even a medium-sized state like Colorado, and you are, just by being in the building, you are now a policy leader. and there's free access to, it's not like Congress. I lobbied in Congress for National Audubon Society, and, it would take, weeks and weeks to get meetings. And, Colorado, these are part-time legislators, so you can really have a big impact. And in many states, it's even smaller in Colorado. So I think the next 5 years for solar and energy storage, my vision is that you'll see batteries at every facility in the world, right? So every home, factory, school will have the ability to have solar either on their rooftop or out in the field, paired with a battery system. So there'll be 24/7 potentially renewable power availability, as well as for emergencies, fires, storms, etc. You're seeing places in Louisiana right now where the power's been out for 6 to 8 weeks, and that's a red state, right? And so that's intolerable. But what you're also starting to see is a transformation of the political mindset of what I would call the conservative voter. So I do residential solar as well. And I was working with this woman who lives in rural Colorado, and she's telling me about her ranch and how dry it is, and she wants to put solar panels out there. And she responded to my email, and the last thing she wrote was, "Go Trump." But here she was for an hour talking about solar on her ranch, and she's doing it. But she is clearly a Trump voter. So that dynamic has changed a lot. And you are seeing the military, farmers, ranchers, sportsmen, fishermen, all realize their businesses, their livelihoods, their homes are in danger from climate change. So it's no longer just the environment, it's their businesses and their whole life. And I think that's where this next 5 years is truly exciting.
And I think you've mentioned, and other folks on the panel have mentioned, that this is not only kind of the push of, the need to defend against climate, but the pull that, we have new technologies and new opportunities to actually do things better. To really, I guess, Monica, you were saying we don't have to kind of give up our cars, and I think you suggested a pogo stick. I'm a big biker, and so is Parrish, but we don't all have to start riding our bikes to work. There will be other ways for us to kind of move forward, and those will create new opportunities for innovation and for entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, I think we've hit on this point a couple of times during this session, that this is an inflection point. And I think about it in terms of when I arrived at Georgetown, it was sort of the heyday of the Reagan era, and government being sort of in the way and regulation being bad, and the, market forces are all great. And I think, we're at the point where some of those things have sort of run their course. I don't want to say failed, but they have run their course. And now we're heading into a whole new era of, I think, government being seen, hopefully now, as there to help, as providing the kind of assistance to get technologies off the ground. We didn't get to a place where we could be the leader in invention and innovation in the world because of the government being sitting on the sidelines. We invented the internet because the government did. We invented, so many of the things that the car, the airplane, all of these things that have transformed lives because of a lot of public support for the science. And I think that's what you're going to see. We got a taste of it with Obama. And that's how we got to the place where solar is so much cheaper now than other sources of power, and why it's going to take off. So I do think we're at a point where, and this is one of those tropes that you hear a lot, oh, technology will solve all our problems. It won't. It takes humans and judgment and morality. But I do think we're at a point where the government's going to invest a lot in science and technology, and that will drive the next 50 years and probably change our lives in ways that may seem dramatic now, but I don't think will be so fundamental. We may drive an electric car instead of a car, but we're not going to go without cars. We may ride more bikes just because we like to, and even those might be electric. We might eat more veggie burgers than hamburgers, but we're not going to give up, having something on a bun. So I think we can find ways to keep the things that we love, but transform them into ways that into things that are more sustainable. And so I'm very hopeful, and I do think states and local governments are places where a lot of that innovation is going to bubble up from. And the fact that we had a president like Trump who thought wind turbines caused cancer meant that states and local governments had to step up and get involved and do things that they might not have otherwise. So that was good. But now I think, we're at a new wave of environmental investment and technology and governance that you'll see, changing the way we approach government and society, not necessarily changing who we are or what we like to do.
And it's interesting for me to hear, as Dean of the McCourt School, it's interesting for me to hear you talk about how interconnected these things are, because we have the advantage. Georgetown is a wonderful university because it is an R1 research university, but it's also a small school, and there really is collaboration with the college, with the business school, with SFS across campus, as well as connections, to government and to, nonprofits and folks in the civil society who are all working on these things together. And within McCourt, we have political scientists, like, in the kind of environmental area, we have folks who are economists, who are political scientists, who are biologists, who have a variety of different perspectives on this issue. And we really do have to kind of pull all of those things together to solve this problem. And I think that's increasingly the case for these key problems, whether it's climate change or racial justice or COVID, or it's not going to be a small technocratic solution. As you said, Monica, it's going to require both, clear solutions to these problems, but then also kind of the moral or the ethical focus to address them, which is a place where I think Georgetown and Georgetown alums have a particular, what I would call as an economist, a real comparative advantage of pulling those things together and thinking about what it means for all of us together, what we need to do as individuals and collectively to move things forward. So I want to ask Trish, since you said that when you got to the Washington Post, you said, we're not going to talk about is there climate change or not. We're going to move beyond that. So as you think about the next 5 years, what do you see as the agenda? What are the issues that you think are going to be key? And then, Parrish, I'm going to pick on you and ask you what effect you think that's going to have, just warning you ahead of time.
That's not fair. No, I'm kidding. I don't really know exactly how to answer your question. I think that the next 5 years, I hope, will be completely transformative. I mean, I think that we are on the cusp of something along the lines of the Industrial Revolution, the digital revolution. I was born at a time when there was no internet. I mean, it's very, we forget how possible it is for everything to change. Technology really can change everything all at once. I mean, it's true, right? So I expect everything is going to change. I am hope my personal fantasy about the fate of the planet is that we figure out that this is our moment. It's not very difficult to do math. Okay, we know exactly what carbon emissions are. We know exactly what they need to be. Right now, we need to cut greenhouse gases in half by 2030. So the math is clear, the map, and it's also a map, right? It tells you exactly what we need to do in order to not have to deal with 3 degrees Celsius by 2100. So to me, it's all about, I mean, I think the table is laid right now, and we're way better off than we were, say, 2 months ago. And now the sky's the limit, right? When you were talking, there are so many ways that our world can change. One problem, for example, hamburgers. Okay, I too love red meat. I come from, I'm Central American, and definitely am into my meat. The other day on Climate Solutions, our page that is our positive page, we wrote a story about how there's a certain kind of seaweed that they're using to feed cows, and the cows who ingest the seaweed do not burp, and that lack of burping does not promote greenhouse gases, and therefore, if you give your cows some seaweed, you can still eat hamburgers. And I think that small story, which of course didn't get a lot of play because, it's hard to compete with, Trump news every single day, every single minute. But we're going to see this. We're going to see this happening all around us, right? There is a problem. Oh, here is the fix. Here's a problem. Oh, here is the fix. And so that is going to be our job, is to write the stories of this moment in history. Our job is to hold people accountable and to hold ourselves accountable, and all of our viewers and readers, etc., accountable to meet the moment. It's not optional, right? It's totally not optional to just sort of give up. And some people are going to be rich and happy and everybody else is going to suffer. That's just not the future. No, we will go down. That's not going to happen. And if it does, we'll make it very unpleasant for others, for the beneficiaries, because that's our job.
So I'm going to turn to Parrish, but I'm also going to tell the folks that are joining us that we will be taking questions. So please feel free to enter them into the chat so that we can, so I can share your questions with our panelists. But Parrish, as you address this question, could you also talk a little bit about generational divide? You mentioned the kind of partisan divide, but is there also a difference across folks who might have a clearer expectation of being around 50 years from now than people who might not?
Yeah, there definitely is. We see that young people across the political parties are more supportive of climate action and more interested in this issue than are their older partisan counterparts. So that's definitely true. One thing, it's a bit unclear because partisan signals are still so strong. So it's not totally clear that so the signals that Republicans are getting from their partisan leaders is one of lots of climate denial in many cases. That is not true in every case. There are a lot of conservatives and a lot of Republicans who are more on board and consciously trying to promote market-oriented solutions on the right. But the big national message is that. And so it's unclear whether young Republicans just haven't sort of received that message as strongly yet, and they could be aging into the party, and as they become more, I guess, indoctrinated in party politics, they could sort of adopt the more traditional position of their party. We just don't know that yet. It's difficult to, that's something that's difficult to assess because this is a relatively new phenomenon that young people are so much more concerned. But it is hopeful. And I think just to speak to what both Trish and JW were saying, that everything is changing, and we can't predict the future. I think the big changes that are happening in the economy and the fact that investors are really pushing companies to voluntarily take on more climate mitigation oriented corporate policies could really change the political landscape. And then, I mean, our political landscape is undergoing a process of huge dramatic change anyway. And I think if industry becomes less carbon intensive, and we see a realignment really of that interest of sort of the extractive industry and the way that it influences politics, those messages that are coming from the national political elites will really change as well. So I think, I guess, to speak to your other question, that's something that I am hopeful for in the next 5 years as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we've talked about Democrats and Republicans, but not independents, who are a huge swath of the electorate now, and they really are the people that we try to talk to too. It's funny, I'm probably more blatantly partisan than Trish could be in her job at the Washington Post, and yet I also really hope to try to talk about politics in a way that appeals, and climate change and environmental issues. So we often don't cover it as climate per se. We cover these issues as clean air or clean water or clean and healthy oceans or parks and land, green spaces, things that are more universally sort of popular. So I think a lot of it is changing because there is this big group in the middle who is really able to be influenced now in a way that Republicans are sort of turned off and won't listen to these topics as much. Again, why public policy matters, trying to appeal to politicians and to public policy makers to think about that big group in the middle.
Well, I mean, I think another reason that public policy matters is for kind of large scale change. And that's one of the questions that we have from one of the folks that has joined us today, who says, how do we think differently about the infrastructure build out required to effectively utilize hydrogen within a given economy like the US? Or more generally, how do we innovate around enormous infrastructure costs and timetables that would be required to take on these kinds of things?
Yeah, I can tackle some of that. I don't work in hydrogen, and you're seeing some folks, especially Toyota, has stuck with sort of a mindset that hydrogen is going to be a winner. But I think the answer on infrastructure is that long-term investment that the U.S. has not been very good at for a number of years. And Tom Friedman talks about this all the time. If I could be, China for a day, I'd build an airport, or I'd build a, train station that works. And it's really true. We have just absolutely neglected our infrastructure. And so we have a unique moment, both federally and at the state level, to make that infrastructure green. And so that is the charging stations of the future. Electrification of everything is going to be our airports, our train stations, our Hyperloop. I mean, it is all happening, but it has to be thoughtful. And, the politics are, it's either going to be a sledgehammer to certain people that are sort of the archaic way of thinking, or they're going to see the jobs and the opportunities. And I do think young conservatives, I'm hopeful, twofold. I mean, I'm a partisan to some extent, so I think there'll be less and less young conservatives just because some of those issues they've not won on, specifically climate. But then they will see the jobs of the future are in these industries, which might be Hyperloop or solar powered cars or whatever it might be. And that's where the infrastructure investments have to be. But coming out of COVID, we can be very, very real at the state and federal level that dollars going to mass transit should be about electrifying and making them cleaner. It just has to be that connection. And I think we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to do it, and we have to do it.
I mean, I think another connection with COVID, it may be less direct, but more kind of in the general atmosphere, is that I think our understanding of how important it is for us to work together, how we can't just think about narrowly in the short run or narrowly provincially. If COVID teaches us anything, it teaches us the importance of working together and the inability for any one of us to be safe or healthy on our own if we don't take into account our environment. And that actually touches on a second question that we got from somebody who has joined us this afternoon, who asks, what are the key questions that we need to tackle at the intersection of climate change and racial equity? For example, households of color are disproportionately disadvantaged by living in substandard housing and in areas that are most vulnerable to environmental hazards. We were talking, JW, earlier about folks in Louisiana not having power for extended period of time. How are we going to address those two things? And I think there's lots of pieces to this. Like, how are we going to address it in the media? How are we going to address it from policymaking? How do we think about changes across communities and the connections between environmental and climate change issues, which I think historically were sort of seen as more elite, like the luxury of thinking about those issues, to now really seeing them as pretty fundamental. There are a lot of environmental justice issues that have really risen.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I founded my first solar company because I was frustrated that all the money in early solar, 07, 08, was going to big homes and mansions. And so we started Main Street Power. We did the first new market tax credit projects to bring solar into urban neighborhoods that were often left behind. And that combination of a double tax incentive made those projects attractive to Morgan Stanley, our finance partner. And we need to do that exact same thing again. It is an example where distributed, localized energy is going to be more racially fair and more egalitarian than big monopolized power structures. And so whether it's in rural Louisiana or rural Colorado, we need to give people the power to power their own homes, or multifamily housing, which is another area I work a lot on, where renewable energy, due to some quirks in how meters work from utilities, is very challenging in multifamily housing. Well, let's get rid of that quirk. It's very easy. We can do it. It's just a matter of willpower to deliver the benefits of clean energy to everybody, not just folks that own a mansion that can afford to think about it.
And I think also, just to build on that, transforming gas heat to electric heat is another big, really important thing that's going to need to happen. And there's going to need to be household level support for that. That looks a lot like the program that JW just mentioned, but is focused instead on retrofitting homes to convert them. Because, you know, if you're a low income household, you're not going to just go buy an induction stove to replace your gas stove in the way that you might if you're a higher income person with a lot of disposable income. So I think that's a big need as well.
I'll jump in and say, and this is where I'll also say that I worked on some of the transition work for the Biden administration, and this whole of government approach will drive a lot of this change through some of the other sectors, and housing is one of them, but manufacturing is another, defense is another. You know, we will see, I think, defense sites are often in communities that are BIPOC, that are, you know, and the Defense Department has some waste problems that they have to clean up, frankly. And so I think there is a way to drive a lot of this change in this whole of government approach to both climate and environmental justice that you see the Biden administration really putting front and center. That's so different even than the Obama administration in terms of its focus on parts of the government that really hadn't thought about climate as central to their mission and their activities, and environmental justice or racial justice being part of the solution. You can't have a solution without impacting these communities who've been left behind. Fence line communities, they're often called. Mm-hmm. So,
well, I think this is one of the hardest issues and questions before us, because I really don't think that these communities have necessarily been left behind, as opposed to intentionally screwed over. I'm sure I could say that here. We're among friends, aren't we? So to me, it's been eye-opening to witness my own children who are in college, their reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, my fellow journalists at the Post, Black journalists at the Post. I mean, I have learned so much in 3 months, and I thought I knew a lot. Okay, so this is a very painful reality that is going to be difficult, really, really hard. We have the 1% on the one hand. We know that everybody who can, the people who can afford to adapt to a warmer climate are rich people. We know that rich people have the largest carbon footprints on the planet, of course, per capita. So, like, the rich are fine. But there is so much to be done. And I am glad that the Biden administration is looking at attacking environmental racism and racism in general, is similarly to climate, which is a whole of government approach. But that is very, very difficult, and is going to call upon us to think differently about how we got to this place, and why are we at this moment right now, and what is the connection between the assault on the White House, the assault on the Capitol, and our very own Civil War. It seems to me that it is all one continuous line, and it is a challenge before us, especially as an alum of Georgetown and a Catholic, that we attack these problems with compassion and curiosity, and not to imagine that we know everything there is to know about this, because this is bad.
Well, I would just say, Trish, kind of drawing on what a number of you have said, you know, COVID has made clear how connected all these things are, right? So part of what got us to this place with the pandemic is climate change and changes to our environment. It has also demonstrated the impact of climate change has demonstrated, again, kind of racial and class inequalities in terms of who's been exposed and who's not, and who has had the resources and access and who has not. And I think it's also made fundamentally clear how absolutely critical it is for us to figure out how to work together, right? Mm-hmm. Which means, you know, on the one hand, so we've talked a little bit about partisanship here. It does mean building coalitions across people who have somewhat different perspectives. Maybe not people who believe there isn't a problem, but people who feel like government is going to be the main solution to this problem. And there are people who think that government is more likely to be an impediment and we mostly need to think about private sector solutions, right? So we have to have a vigorous debate and we'll have to engage in a couple of many different strategies. But I really do feel like, maybe because I am an optimist at heart, I'm a glass half full person for sure, which is you find a lot of us in policy schools because you wouldn't take on public policy if you weren't a glass half full person. That really the intersecting crises that we face right now, both as a country and as a planet, really do give us no choice but to figure out how to work together better and how to be able to innovate across the public and private sector, how to draw on all the resources that you see here on this screen and all the resources that are with us on this call among all of our alumni. And I think folks at Georgetown have a particular ability and responsibility to contribute to that. We are just particularly well positioned. And you can see that from everything that you all have accomplished. That's amazing. And I think you see the aspiration for more of that at the McCourt School, that, you know, that is, you know, our namesake, Frank McCourt, stepped up to found the school with kind of a very clear, and I think not just because of what happened on the Capitol, but 7-10 years ago, really saw that there was a need for a school that would leverage everything that was good about Georgetown and that commitment to the public good and create a policy school in DC that would really have that focus. And we are all about trying to really accelerate that progress and those contributions. So I just really want to thank everybody on this panel for taking the time to talk with you. It's just been marvelous. I've learned an enormous amount from each of you. I want to thank the hundreds of alums and friends who joined us. We got to a few of your questions. There's lots more questions. We will continue to have events like this and opportunities for conversation. So thanks to everybody for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.